An elderly man was cleaning out his dusty old barn when his boot hit a rusty metal locker buried under decades of silence. He thought it was just junk until he opened it. Inside, he found something that would shake his soul. A secret his late wife had hidden, a connection he never knew existed, and a family he thought he'd lost forever. Stay with us, because what's inside this locker will leave you in tears. And if stories like this speak to your heart, hit that subscribe button. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Out in the gentle hills of rural Oregon, where the wind moves slow and the sky stretches quiet, there lived a man named Henry. He was 78 years old, tall and slightly stooped, with a voice like worn leather and eyes that still held a spark, though the years had taken much from him. Henry lived alone on the farm he'd once shared with his wife, Evelyn, before cancer took her 13 winters ago. The white farmhouse had chipped paint now, and the barn out back groaned every time the wind pressed too hard against it. Still, he stayed, not because he had to, but because leaving felt like saying goodbye to her all over again. Most days were the same: coffee at dawn, feeding the chickens, listening to old country records on the porch as the sun dipped below the wheat fields. His world had become smaller, quieter, and he thought he had seen the last of life's surprises. But one rainy afternoon, while clearing out a far corner of the barn he hadn't touched in years, Henry's boot nudged something metal beneath an old tarp. A locker, rusty, locked shut, and humming with memory. What he would find inside would unravel everything he thought was finished and begin something entirely new. Henry stood over the locker, rain tapping the barn's tin roof like a slow, steady heartbeat. It was heavier than it looked, coated in rust, with one hinge nearly gone and a padlock so old it crumbled when he tapped it with the back of a wrench. He hesitated. That corner of the barn, it had always belonged to Evelyn. She used it for storage, kept old crates, holiday decorations, even a wooden cradle from when their daughter was born. After she passed, Henry couldn't bring himself to go through it. He let time settle over it like dust. But now something pulled him in. The locker creaked open with a reluctant sigh, and inside he saw a folded quilt, first hand-stitched with soft, faded patterns. He ran his fingers across it and nearly smiled. Evelyn had made that one during their first year of marriage. "Too pretty to use," she'd said. "We'll save it for something special." Beneath the quilt were boxes, small, shallow, carefully labeled in Evelyn's handwriting. One read, "Henry's Letters, 1964, 1971. Another, "Our Baby Girl, Memories, and the Last." Buried at the very bottom simply said, "For later." Henry's hands trembled as he opened the first box. Dozens of envelopes sat inside, each one addressed in his own handwriting. He blinked, confused at first. Then it hit him. These were his letters. The ones he'd written to Evelyn while stationed overseas during the war. He had thought they were long gone, burned in a house flood, or misplaced through moves. But she had saved every single one, tied together with a yellow ribbon, fragile and stained with time. He pulled one out, opened it gently. It began, "My dearest Evelyn, the nights are cold here, but I close my eyes and see you in that blue dress, twirling barefoot in the kitchen. If I don't make it home, just know, loving you was the bravest thing I ever did." Henry pressed the letter to his chest. He hadn't read those words in 50 years. He opened the second box. Inside were tiny shoes, a lock of soft blonde hair, faded photographs of their daughter, Grace as a toddler. There was even a cassette tape labeled Grace's first song in Evelyn's handwriting. Henry smiled through tears. That sweet voice, he could still hear it in the back of his memory. Grace had died in a car accident at only 23. He never quite recovered. Evelyn had been the stronger one, holding them together through grief. Now, he realized she had carried all of it, quietly, lovingly, preserving the memories he was too broken to face. Finally, with breath caught in his throat, he reached for the last box for later. Inside was a sealed envelope and an old photograph of the two of them young, in love, standing in front of the very same barn. Evelyn had written on the back, "If you're reading this, it means you're still here, and I'm not. But maybe this will help you remember that my love was never meant to haunt you. It was meant to heal you. I saved the best parts of our life because I knew one day you'd need to see them again. You weren't meant to just survive, Henry. You were meant to live again. Love always, Evelyn." He sat there for a long time, the barn around him silent except for the rain. He wept not out of regret, but out of relief. For years, he'd been carrying his grief like a weight. But here, in this forgotten locker, Evelyn had given him a gift permission to let go, to move forward without shame. She hadn't just saved the past. She had preserved a path back to himself. The days that followed were quieter than usual, though something inside Henry had begun to stir. He moved more slowly through the house, not from age, but from presence. He took time to notice things he had long ignored: the smell of cinnamon Evelyn used to sprinkle on her morning toast, the way sunlight fell across the kitchen table at exactly 9:17 a.m., just like it had every morning for decades. He even opened windows he'd long kept shut, as if letting her memory breathe again. But it was what came in the mail a week later that truly shook him. A small, unmarked envelope. No return address, just his name, Henry Whitlow, in familiar, graceful cursive. For a moment, he thought maybe someone from the town had read about the letters. He'd mentioned it in passing at church, and word traveled fast in their quiet part of Oregon. But when he opened the envelope, his hands went cold. Inside was a folded letter and a photo. The photo showed a young woman in her 20s, sitting on a park bench with a little boy no older than 5. The child had soft blonde hair, and his daughter Grace's eyes. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Whitlow, my name is Sarah. I believe I'm your granddaughter. I didn't know your daughter Grace growing up. My mother placed me for adoption when I was a baby, but after my adoptive mom passed, I started searching. I found old hospital records, and with the help of a kind librarian and some DNA sites, I believe Grace was my birth mother. I don't want anything from you. I saw your name in an online registry, and I had to write, that little boy in the photo is my son. His name is Eli. I don't know if I'm right, but I hope I am, because if I am, it means I still have family. With love, Sarah." Henry stared at the letter for a long time. His hands trembled. Could it be true? He had never known Grace was pregnant. She'd left for college just before the accident, never made it to her second week of classes. Evelyn never mentioned anything, but it would make sense, wouldn't it? Grace had become quiet toward the end, more withdrawn, and Evelyn had always kept parts of her grief close to her chest. He pulled the photograph closer. The woman had Grace's chin, her posture, her eyes. And the boy, Lord, he looked like Grace had when she was 5 and caught frogs down by the creek. Tears blurred Henry's vision before he could stop them. For so many years, he had thought the Whitlow name would end with him, that everything Evelyn had preserved in that old locker would one day be boxed away by strangers and auctioned off at some estate sale. But now, the thought struck him like sunlight through clouds. He wasn't the last. Somewhere out there was a little boy, his great-grandson, chasing butterflies in some city park, completely unaware of the old man out in Oregon whose heart was breaking open in the best possible way. Henry folded the letter with shaking hands and held it to his chest. After a long moment, he stood, walked into the kitchen, and pulled open the top drawer where Evelyn used to keep her stationery. He chose the nicest envelope he could find and began to write. Dear Sarah, if what you say is true, then the miracle I never dared hope for has just walked into my life. I would love to meet you both. There is so much I want to tell you about your mother, about Evelyn, about the farm, and if you're willing, there's a swing under an old oak tree here, just waiting for Eli. 2 weeks later, Henry stood on the porch. Smoothing down the collar of his best flannel shirt, the one Evelyn always said made his eyes look kind. He hadn't worn it in years, not since her funeral. The gravel road was empty, except for the hum of cicadas and the slow sway of wheat dancing in the breeze. But Henry's heart was pounding, louder than any summer wind. Then, just past noon, a dusty blue sedan pulled into the driveway. Henry held his breath. From the car stepped a young woman, nervous, unsure, but with a grace that felt deeply familiar. Her son, little Eli, jumped out beside her, holding a tattered stuffed elephant. And Henry just stared, not at her clothes, not at her hesitation, but at the way her smile trembled, just like Grace's used to when she was trying to be brave. Mr. Whitlow, she asked, her voice soft but clear. He nodded, throat too tight to speak. Then he took a step forward, opened his arms, and to his own surprise, Sarah walked into them. No words, just the warmth of decades that had longed for this moment, without ever knowing it. Eli tugged at Henry's sleeve. Are you my grandpa? Henry laughed, choked and watery. He knelt down. Not quite. Buddy, I think I'm your great-grandpa. Eli's eyes widened. That's even bigger. They spent the afternoon on the porch swing, with lemonade and quiet conversation. Sarah asked about Grace, who she was, what she loved, how she laughed. Henry told her everything. The way she used to dance in rainstorms, how she hated pickles, how she had a habit of writing poetry in the margins of her math books. Then Sarah shared her own story, foster homes, adoption, a life pieced together with more questions than answers. But through it all, she said, there was always a part of her that felt like something was still out there, waiting. Henry listened not just with ears, but with his whole spirit. He had spent years in a kind of emotional hibernation, just surviving from day to day, thinking the best parts of life had ended with Evelyn and Grace. But now he saw the truth. He hadn't been left behind. He'd simply been waiting for this. For Sarah, for Eli, for the chance to become something he never thought he'd be again needed. That night, after they left with promises to return next weekend, Henry sat by the window in Evelyn's old chair. The house felt fuller than it had in years. The creaks in the floor weren't so lonely anymore. They were the echoes of laughter, the scuff of Eli's sneakers, the soft shuffle of new life entering old spaces. He looked over at the photograph still sitting on the mantel. Evelyn's smile, frozen in time, seemed just a little brighter tonight. I see it now, Henry whispered aloud, his voice barely more than a breath. You knew. You always knew. He had spent so long thinking life was about holding on to memories, to sorrow, to what was lost. But now he understood. Sometimes, to really live again, you have to open your hands. Let go of what you thought the ending would be, and let something new begin. Autumn came early that year. The maple trees lining the dirt road to Henry's farm began to glow with gold and crimson, and the air took on that crispness that made every breath feel cleaner, sharper, more alive. It had only been a month since Sarah and Eli first arrived, but to Henry, it felt like he'd known them his whole life. They came every Saturday now, sometimes with cookies, sometimes with questions, always with warmth. And little by little, the silence that had once filled Henry's world began to retreat. He started fixing up the old barn, not because it needed it, but because Eli loved climbing the loft ladder and pretending it was a pirate ship. He cleared out Evelyn's old garden patch, now overrun with weeds, and showed Sarah how Evelyn used to plant marigolds along the edges just to keep the bunnies honest. One afternoon, as they sat at the picnic table out back, Eli asked the question that would change everything. "Can we live here someday?" Sarah looked up, startled. Eli's sweetheart. But Henry smiled, eyes soft. "Why not?" he said gently. "This place has room, and I think maybe it's been waiting for you." The idea grew like ivy, slowly, quietly, then suddenly, everywhere. Sarah had been working long hours at a nursing clinic in the city. Rent was high, hours were brutal, and Eli barely had a backyard to run in. But here, there was space, air, time, a school just down the road, neighbors who waved from tractors. At first, Sarah resisted. "It's too generous," she whispered to Henry one evening as they sat under the stars. But Henry shook his head. "No," he said. "You don't understand. You're giving me back everything I thought I'd lost. You think I'm the one giving you something. But Sarah, you're giving me a reason to wake up with a full heart. You and that boy are the spring I thought I'd never see again." That was how it began. By winter, Sarah had officially moved in. The guest room became hers. Eli's room had bunk beds and a mural of stars that Henry painted himself crooked, charming, perfect. They kept Grace's room just as it was, like a quiet shrine to memory. But now it was filled with light again, the window always open. The community took notice. People who hadn't seen Henry in years now saw him walking hand in hand with Eli at the general store. He was no longer the quiet widower on the hill. He was something else entirely. He was home to someone, and they were home to him. Sarah began volunteering at the small-town clinic. Eli joined the little schoolhouse down the road. On Sunday mornings, they sat beside Henry at church, and neighbors whispered that it was like watching a family that had always been meant to find each other just a few decades late. One snowy morning, as Henry watched Eli build a crooked snowman in the yard, Sarah came to stand beside him on the porch. She didn't say anything at first. Then she asked softly, "Do you ever wish things had been different? That Grace had told you?" Henry's eyes stayed on Eli, laughing, arms deep in snow. "I used to," he said, "but now, I think maybe it all happened the way it had to, because if I'd known then, I might have held on too tight. And maybe I wouldn't have been ready to love them the way I do now." He turned to her, smiled gently. "Some things don't bloom until the frost hits." By the time spring rolled in again, Henry had become something no one, least of all himself, had ever expected a man reborn. Not in the dramatic, movie-ending kind of way, but in the slow, steady rhythm of a man learning how to feel again, how to hope again. He now woke up not to silence, but to the sound of Eli's tiny footsteps bounding down the stairs. Sometimes the boy would crawl into bed beside him before sunrise, whispering, "Tell me another story about Mama Grace," and Henry would, not from memory, but from feeling, He told Eli about the time Grace put bubble gum in Evelyn's shoes, or the day she sang at the county fair and forgot the words halfway through, then kept going with made-up lyrics that made everyone laugh. Eli soaked it in like sunlight, like every word was a thread reconnecting him to the mother he never knew. And with each story, Henry found a part of himself again, too. Not just as a father, but as a legacy keeper, a healer, a man who finally let his heart come out of hiding. Sarah noticed the change in him long before Henry did. His posture, once weighed down by years of solitude, was lighter now. His laugh came easier. His eyes crinkled not just from age but from joy. He was planting again, tomatoes, corn, even a few apple trees out by the barn. Might not live long enough to taste 'em. He'd chuckle, but Eli will. And maybe that was the point. For the first time in years, Henry was doing things for tomorrow, not just out of habit, but out of hope. He even found himself reaching out more, writing letters to old friends, calling his brother in Idaho, hosting Sunday potlucks on the porch with neighbors who used to just wave from a distance. People said he seemed younger, but Henry knew better. He wasn't younger, he was finally whole. One afternoon, as he and Sarah shelled peas together on the porch, she looked over and said quietly, "You've changed. You know." Henry smiled. "So have you." She nodded. "But yours, it's different. Like you're not afraid to be seen anymore." Henry sat with that for a moment, watching Eli chase butterflies in the tall grass. "I guess for a long time," he said slowly, "I thought grief was a wall, something you build around your heart to keep everything else out. But I think it's more like a window. You don't stop feeling, you just start seeing the world through it. Softer, slower, but somehow clearer." Sarah reached over and gently touched his hand. "That sounds like something Evelyn would have said." Henry chuckled. "No, Evelyn would have said, 'Stop talking in riddles and go fix the fence.'" They both laughed easy, light. But under the laughter was something unspoken, something sacred. Henry had grown not by forgetting the past, but by letting it breathe, by allowing new roots to grow in soil once thought barren. That night, as he sat writing in a fresh leather journal Sarah had gifted him for his birthday, Henry wrote just one sentence on the first page. "It turns out, even old hearts can stretch wide enough to hold more love." The day Eli called him Grandpa without thinking twice, Henry felt something shift so deep in his chest, he had to turn away to hide the tears. They were in the barn, sanding down an old rocking horse that once belonged to Grace. Henry had stored it away, unable to part with it, unable to look at it. But now, with Eli's laughter echoing off the beams and sunlight pouring through the slats, the horse seemed less like a relic of pain and more like a bridge between generations. "Grandpa," Eli called, "can we paint it blue?" Mama says that was Grace's favorite color. Henry froze. Not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Instead, it healed. He turned, smiling through the shimmer in his eyes. "Blue it is, partner." That evening, as dusk settled over the wheat fields and fireflies blinked like scattered stars, the three of them sat on the porch together. Sarah cradled a mug of tea. Eli dozed in Henry's lap, his head resting against the old man's chest. The sky turned that soft, glowing pink that only spring evenings can summon, and the world felt still, complete. Sarah looked over. "You know, I think this is what Mom would have wanted. For us to find you, for you to find us." Henry nodded. She always had a way of seeing the finish line, even when the rest of us were still running. There was a long silence. the kind that didn't need to be filled. Then Sarah asked, "Do you ever wish things had happened sooner?" Henry didn't answer right away. He looked out at the fields, then down at Eli's tiny hand wrapped around his finger. And he said, with a softness only time can teach no, "Because maybe if it happened sooner, I wouldn't have been ready. Maybe I needed to lose everything, to learn how much I still had to give." The words surprised even him, but they felt true. He'd spent so many years thinking his story was over, just a quiet, fading chapter at the back of a book. But now, he knew better. The story had never ended. It had just paused, waiting for a page he didn't know still existed. And now, in the twilight of his years, that page was turning. Slowly, beautifully. He found himself writing again little things. Notes in the margins of Evelyn's old cookbooks. Letters he never sent. Thoughts scribbled on scraps of paper and tucked into Eli's lunchbox. He started reading at the church again. Not because anyone asked, but because his voice once closed by grief had found its way home. And sometimes, late at night, he'd walk out to the barn with nothing but a lantern and his memories. He'd sit beside that locker still dented, still rusted, and whisper a quiet thank you. Not to the past, but to whatever force had kept it safe for so long until he was ready to open it. That summer, Sarah hosted a small gathering in the yard. Just a few neighbors, some kids from Eli's school. Henry stood at the edge of the porch, watching it all: laughter, music, life, and felt like a man who had lived two lives, one before the locker and one after. He turned to the crowd, raised his glass, and said with a chuckle, "Turns out, you can still grow something beautiful, even if you start with nothing but rust and old memories." The people laughed, some wiped tears. And in that moment, Henry knew. He hadn't just found a family. He'd found a future. He'd become the kind of man who didn't just remember love, but passed it on. And perhaps that was the miracle all along. Grief has a way of convincing us that the story is over, that once we lose the people we love, there's nothing left but memories and silence. Henry believed that for years, surviving in stillness, convinced his chapter had closed. But the truth is, life always holds another page, and sometimes the most meaningful moments come not in the beginning, but near the end when we're finally tender enough to feel them fully. The lesson: you're never too old, too broken, or too late to be found. And sometimes, when you think the best parts of your story are behind you, life hands you a key, points you to the barn, and whispers, "Not yet." If this story moved you, subscribe for more. And if someone you love needs a reminder that it's never too late, share this with them. One old locker, one forgotten letter. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin again.